proximate cause for murder or danger to the lives of any of our citizens, then the government ought to be in a position to own that and also to compensate for it. Now, the first time I uttered those words, there was a firestorm. I had no idea that anyone would think that that was a bizarre or strange thing for a cabinet officer to say.
O'Leary's statement is so unusual that the national media picks the story up, and the Department of Energy is overwhelmed with thousands of phone calls each day. She starts an in-house investigation at the Department of Energy. The task is not an easy one. It requires a review of millions of documents in government archives and warehouses all over the United States. Many of them are still classified. O'Leary brings the issue before President Clinton, and in 1994 he forms a Presidential Advisory Committee to look into human experimentation with radiation. The committee does not investigate the bacteriological and chemical tests.
Why?
After a year of intensive work, the committee submits their report to the president.
If this committee's work is to mean anything, it has to be that 50 years from now, there does not have to be another presidential committee charged with investigating allegations of abuses of human subjects.
Why?
The report reviews the history of human experimentation and investigates ethical standards, but it fails to satisfy the expectations of the victims.
Essentially what the committee did was say these experiments are wrong, but no one is to blame. So they did not find one doctor or one institution guilty. And as far as this large community of people who had been abused and unethically used in these experiments, the committee recommended that only the families of the plutonium patients be compensated. They came out with a report that does have some good information, but families of people who feel that they were used in these experiments are essentially still at ground zero when it comes to getting these documents.
I think if I were on the other side, I'd be feeling the same thing. Especially since the experiment, the effort had begun with such lofty expressions of ideals from me, from the President of the United States, and from Ruth Faden, who chaired that committee. We overpromised because we were so naive. We didn't know the government couldn't and didn't know how to deliver. We were all very naive.
This morning I signed an executive order instructing every arm and agency of our government that conducts, supports, or regulates research involving human beings to review immediately their procedures.
Some new procedures are already in place.
He was going from high fevers to chills. He had hallucinations, and so it was a very, very serious infection and fever that was causing all that in him.
The Serratia marcescens infection is so unusual to the doctors and scientists at the hospital that 3 of them team up and write a scientific article about it. At the time, the doctors are unaware of the tests the Army had conducted using the same type bacteria just days before. The scientific article is published in October 1951 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, reaching a very limited readership. However, the Army does see the article, and a panel of 4 military scientists reviews the case.
Some months after, they concluded, and this is a very strange conclusion, that the Army's bacteria and the bacteria that caused the infections in the hospital were not of the same strain or the same nature, and that any relationship was apparently coincidental.
Human experimentation hasn't been limited to the United States. The British government recently admitted that millions were secretly sprayed with a toxic chemical in the 1950s and 60s. Military officials conducting germ warfare experiments thought they were spraying a harmless substance, but later discovered the chemicals may have contributed to medical problems. Critics accuse the government of gambling with public health. Documented that the CIA tested the effects of LSD on hundreds of unsuspecting subjects in the 1950s, and that the government withheld treatment from black syphilis victims during the infamous Tuskegee experiment. Not so well known is that many other Americans were used as human guinea pigs. Our program reveals how government agencies exposed millions to toxic chemicals and radioactivity without permission and, according to critics, without regard for the potential dangers.
It is a very, very important piece of America's history, and it will shape America's future.
Scientists have no First Amendment protection, none. They're not free to speak out anyway. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, there's a federal gag order. I want all your listeners to consider that. There's a federal gag order on all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees. I mean, how much more obvious is this situation? They're trying to plug leaks in the ship. And we have environmental scientists being fired all over. Canada's let go a huge number of their scientists. Australia has just fired 450 of their frontline environmental scientists. Why? Because they want to cover up what's happening in any way they can. And again, they're simply trying to obscure the severity of what's unfolding from the public as long as possible. So I would argue this again. If we don't take care of what's happening in our environment, in our skies right now, nothing else is going to matter. All these financial plans that people have and all their future aspirations won't mean anything soon.
Declassified documents reveal that from the end of World War II through the Cold War, hidden under a veil of secrecy, the U.S. government performed military tests on large populations. In the late 40s and early 50s, patients were injected with a radioactive substance while in their hospital bed.
See, my father never told me. I never knew that this happened to him.
Soldiers were exposed to radiation to test their performance in a nuclear war. In the 1950s, the Army released bacteria and chemicals at sea, in the air, and underground.
I found out that 4 of my pals that lived directly across the street from me had all died of cancer. These are 4 separate families.
In 1995, a presidential advisory committee confirmed that for more than 3 decades, hundreds of thousands of Americans have been unwitting participants in human experimentation.
It is a very, very important piece of America's history, and it will shape America's future.
Into the environment right now, aluminum oxide nanoparticles and barium nanoparticles, these just happen to be the same materials that they use in nanothermate explosives. And so when this stuff settles down out of the air into the environment, it is small enough to be absorbed through the root structure of the trees in the forest. And so when there's a forest fire, and there will be a forest fire, those fires burn dramatically hotter. The point is that the cost of firefighting, the cost in the healthcare system have nearly doubled in the last 10 years. The amount of acreage is lost because of fires. The impact on human health is dramatic.
I personally tested water and aluminum, and I found aluminum had 47 times the normal expected amounts. Strontium had 10 to 20 times the amounts. Barium was 20 times. This is what the stuff looks like here.
Who is doing all this? From my research, I concluded that it is people like the U.S. military, the Pentagon, international governments, rogue nations, and global corporations. And there's one name that I want to give you to research for yourself, and that is DynCorp. DynCorp is a semi-military organization, has also ties with commercial airlines, and they have patents on vaccines. So interesting. Well, who? Well, this darling, Mr. Brzezinski, Obama's teacher, he said in 1970, technology will make available to the leaders of major nations techniques for conducting secret warfare of which only a bare minimum of the security forces need to be appraised. In fact, I think they have only to warn one official. That's it. And that official can keep his mouth shut so nobody knows. We don't know. We don't hear about it. And techniques of weather modifications could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm. Yes. This is the document that was mentioned earlier also, and the interesting thing is it was written in 1996, and it was created because in that period there was for the first time computer power to compute huge plans that you want to make. So with these same Cray computers with Oracle 8i software, they reverse engineered the 1918 flu virus, which is very similar to the H1N1. And also they had this document with 6 different scenarios, plans. What do we do here in 1996 to have this or that outcome in 2025? And in one of the 6 scenarios...
In the sky in the morning, these tic-tac-toe patterns all over the place. It's got to be more than just jet fumes and trails, huh?
No, it is. In fact, let me give you the history of this thing, how they started it. You know, they originally started this back in the 40s and the 50s, and they were spraying silver iodide, and that was relatively harmless to the environment compared to what they're doing now. But then they started doing more and more cloud seeding and weather control, and then the military decided they were going to start teaching their Air Force academies how to do this. In fact, they actually have chemtrail classes in the military. You actually pull up the journals if you'd like online. And what happens is they're spraying these things through the jet nozzles that go into the engines, and they're creating nanocrystals, and they're being put into the air for the weather radar and for the scalar radar. It creates a particulate plasma that can be activated through microwave energy, such as through piezoelectric crystals or through electric optical properties that can be done through like HARP. You can use HARP, which is microwave energy, in what's called a phased array telescope, or not a telescope, a antenna, George, and you can actually cause this stuff to glow and become incredibly hot, and you can actually heat up a section of it up to 10,000 degrees in just a few seconds. The military want to be able to do that because they have an incoming ICBM missile. They can actually heat this 10,000 degree pocket of air up in front of the missile, and they can actually cause it to explode as soon as it hits this 10,000 degrees. It'll just literally melt the missile, destroying the military vehicle. Strontium and barium strontium can take these chemtrails into the field of scalar physics. This allows you to up-concentrate energy at any spot.